time together has felt both long and brisk. We've traveled alongside one another on a meaningful journey through unpacking the truth. Though it has been 100 years since Dr. Peter H. Bryce released his pamphlet to rally support for Indigenous children in Indian residential schools in 1922, little action followed. Instead of making reforms to Indian education policy in the 20th century, amendments were made to the Indian Act, where attendance was compulsory in 1920. This was done so despite Dr. Bryce's research on the health conditions of Indigenous children in Indian residential schools. Looking back at Dr. Bryce, was he disappointed? Absolutely, because what followed after his research caused tremendous harm and loss of innocent lives for Indigenous peoples. Moreover, what would he say today when seeing the current Indigenous relations in Canada? As we've heard through the numerous conversations with our featured guests, our learning journey towards systemic change and a more equitable future for Indigenous peoples must include knowing the truth. I can even admit, I learn new information from my conversations with our guests. You just never know what people know about Canada's colonial policies to eradicate an entire group of people, the original inhabitants of Turtle Island. Nonetheless, I hope my conversations with my guests left you all much more informed and equipped to have your own courageous conversations with friends, family, colleagues, and perhaps your own children. Remember, this conversation must not be silenced. In fact, the conversations I facilitated with our featured guests are meant to show you what conversation strategies you can bring home. As I share with my students at Brock University, ignorance and discrimination against Indigenous people can live in the home, for our homes are a place of great comfort. It is where we can share our truths. Therefore, bring home this knowledge. Pull out the truth to disrupt hegemony that controls and dominates the everyday narratives. Subsequently, the developer of the learning guides for this podcast, Emily Hoke, has put considerable effort into ways you can actualize the conversations I had with my guests throughout this limited podcast series. Utilize this information and know this conversation is only just beginning, or it is your responsibility to take the next step. Thank you and good luck with your courageous conversations.
Hi, this is Amanda Merpaw, Project Coordinator for Bryce at 100 at Defining Moments Canada. You have just finished listening to We Need to Talk About Bryce, Courageous Conversations with Bobby Henry and Guests, a podcast that features Indigenous educators, public health experts, elders, knowledge keepers, and activists in conversation stemming from Dr. Peter Bryce's 1922 pamphlet, The Story of a National Crime, and drawing connections across time and space. I would like to thank Bobby and his guests for the thoughtful and care-filled conversations about truth and reconciliation, the nature of identity and nationhood in this land we call Canada, how we engage with information and the news, what trauma-informed approaches to public health might look like today, the impacts of colonialism on Indigenous peoples and on systems meant to care for citizens, like education and like health, what contemporary education practices might look like, including education sovereignty and language education, the impacts of residential schools on survivors and across generations, what it means to support young people today, especially young Indigenous people and Indigenous families. Ultimately, these conversations have been about truth, about collective care, about resistance, courage, and humanity as we seek to build a better future that is more just and more hopeful. We Need to Talk About Bryce is just one part of a larger project that is available on the Defining Moments Canada website at definingmomentscanada.ca under Bryce at 100. That project includes learning guides for these episodes, as well as other articles, lesson plans, and education resources engaging in the themes of this podcast and beyond. Going forward, we're excited to announce the next podcast that will be released as part of the Bryce at 100 project. It takes inspiration from Dr. Bryce's work, as a public health official passionate about equitable application of public health best practices and knowledges. This podcast, called Aanodizewin, will feature conversations about the commercial determinants of health and their impacts on Indigenous peoples and communities. Hosts Amy Shawanda and Daniel Eisencraft Klein will facilitate conversations about private sector industries such as alcohol and tobacco, how these industries impact the health of Indigenous peoples as those industries gain financial profit, and how the activities of these corporations worsen inequities between and within communities. Stay tuned for these episodes coming soon wherever you get your podcasts or via our website, where you will also find learning guides for them. We look forward to having you with us, and we thank you for listening. As we go, we leave you with an excerpt of Aanodizewin.
Yeah, there was some really interesting beadwork and painting. Like, you see these bead artists create earrings and they have cabs of KFC, or they have Pepsi or Bepsi beaded in. They're beautifully made, don't get me wrong. But then I'm also thinking, on one hand, as an Indigenous health researcher, I'm like, oh my God, they're promoting. But at the same time, I get it. It's now become part of our culture. I get it. I get why they do it. But then also, I think it's like, again, that survival. It's like the Indian taco that we had. It's so bad for us. But when it was introduced, the ingredients that were introduced to us, it was survival food. It was for us to make it another day. Like, even those foods were spoiled, but it was for us to get it through another day. And there are many artists. I'm not going to single out one artist, but I'm going to just say that these artists that create them, and they actually turn a profit because they're selling these and indigenizing these products, because they've been just become part of our community. Like, I think I can go to any of my aunties or cousins or a friend's house and they have a box of red rose tea in their cupboard. And it's so funny because I'm like, yeah, I'll have one. And it brings back memories of my grandma. So that's why I see why they're part of it. But also at the same time, it's like they're just so ingrained. They just become part into our culture and just part of us now. And I think part of it, like, this is cultural. Like, we survived, we're still here, we're still making it another day. We're still the thorn to the government side, so to say. That's why I think it's become part of our culture in that sense too. It just kind of building off what Dougie had previously said.
So one thing we've touched on is the tendency for individual-based strategies and approaches to address health disparity, and that goes across these industries and across diseases. Melissa, you've talked about the way industry tries to frame these debates on public health towards the individual. And I think that when we talk about a sort of neo-colonial approach, within that, there is a tendency to try to shift for Indigenous communities strategies that are community whole to the individual, right? A sort of, whatever the health issue is, that's on the individual to try to address themselves, whether it's through personal responsibility or behavioral approaches. And that's very industry favored. And then Indigenous communities more generally have commented on this as, a real departure from what traditionally the approach has been. Maybe, Melissa, can you touch on those strategies and why they're trying to frame that debate? And then maybe you can talk more generally about that loss of tradition and the intersections there.
Yeah, so I mean, from the industry side, so of course, when we talk about unhealthy diet, so they won't talk about unhealthy diets, they will talk about people lacking physical activity or people not being responsible enough for their health. So when they go to schools with nutrition programs, is to teach children how to eat better, so focusing on children specifically, but they won't tell you what I've just told you, about ultra processed foods and how those are making us sick. They won't tell the truth about their own products. So some, like, I think it's Nestle who said that 60% of their portfolio is made of unhealthy products, and they won't tell that to children, of course, because they want to be seen as, the ones who can help you get a better education on healthy diets. So we know that they are pushing for that narrative, that individuals are responsible for their health, when we have clear evidence that, it's not the case at all. It's difficult to question that as individuals, because of course it's at the end of the day it's you who is eating, and it's difficult to realize that you've been pushed to eat in a certain way by everything around your culture, the marketing, etc. And often in relation to what was just discussed, so in France, for example, and I am from a mixed background, I don't have that connection with the culture of my ancestors. So the only connection that I have is what I see with what I see on TV, here on the radio, watch on social media, and the industry is present everywhere. So as an individual, when I think about, yes, okay, I'm not healthy, perhaps I don't eat healthily, how can I change? Then you just think about their solutions, because that's what they are promoting. You should do more sports, be more physical, physically active, eat products that have less of that, or less of that other thing, but that are still ultra processed. So that narrative is pushed everywhere, and even our governments just repeat that. We have messages in France on TV, when you have advertisements for food, you have a small message, like you should eat food with less salt, sugar, and fat, and be more active, when we know everything in our modern world is pushing us to consume those foods. So the message is not doing anything. We don't have the power to change, really. So yeah, that's my answer. I don't know if it answers your question, Daniel, or if you want me to add
it's
anything.
great. Well, I've heard the metaphor. It's like throwing someone into the deep ocean as waves crash over them, not giving them swimming lessons, throwing them, telling them a couple things about how to swim, and then when they start to drown.
Yeah, no, one thing that I can mention in really, you made me think about, like those big companies like Unilever, Nestle, and others, they are also the owners of weight loss companies. So of course, they want you to, lose weight and make it as if, it was an issue that that you have, to deal with yourself. Then you go to their product and weight loss companies, instead of just questioning the system that you are in, and thinking that, wait, I can eat differently, to begin with. It's and not just differently by going to the supermarket and eating the same brands, but in smaller portions or reformulated options. No, you can just eat completely differently, but that they won't tell you, sorry.
Doug, could you touch on, given that Indigenous communities have long upheld communal approaches to health, emphasizing the interconnectedness of individuals and then their environment and cultural practices, are there some lessons that could be learned? I'm not trying to educate the food industry, not that optimistic, but lessons that can be learned maybe from public health or the greater public about approaches that aren't quite so individualistic, quite so individually focused. And you can also touch on your approach to as a chef. I feel like we haven't made time here for you to talk about how you brought this into your own world.
What I find and what I see is a very difficult thing is you got to look at the environment. A lot of communities, the environment is not very strong. It's inflicted with a lot of the negative things that really hold you down and keep you back. The positive part of that is, I think, with my generation and the next generation coming, I think we're starting to break a lot of these cycles. And it's hard to, once again, you know what I mean? You can't see the picture when you're standing in the frame. It's almost more common to do the negative things than to do something positive or better, because of that's just the way the water's flowing, unfortunately. But like I said, with the next generation coming up, we're starting to break these cycles and to figure out and teach that there is a different way, getting away from, it all starts with the decisions, right? So the main decision that, plagues us is a lot of the alcohol and drugs. You throw those into the mix, you start throwing in bad eating into the mix, it becomes a lifestyle. And, it's been like that for too long. And that was their plan, and it succeeded for as long as it has. And, but the hope and the way I look at to the future is I believe we're taking the right step And you know, you hear about these elders speak about their traumas, and we learn, we listen, and we adapt, and we kind of put that into perspective a little bit. And you know, how I look at it is kind of just like a recipe when it comes to my cooking, right? You got some of this, you got some of that, you got some of this. Whether it's good, whether it's bad, it is how it comes out in the end. And you know, like Bob Ross said, I think there's only happy mistakes or whatever, beautiful mistakes or something like that. But long story short is, you know, our environment hasn't been as kind as it should be, and that makes us have these. It's easier to make the worst decision than it is to make a good decision, and that's the hard truth. And you know, when we always put, you know, negative decisions over positive, you know, it's a battle that we'll never win until we finally get that education and get that better leadership of, you know, something to do, something to learn, and you know, have places for these kids to grow and be safe,